One of you. Now, today we are continuing on with a brand new sermon series that we started just at the very beginning of November called Villains. And the Bible is full of incredible stories of heroes, lots of heroes. You got King David, you got Jonathan, you got the Apostle Paul, you got Moses, you got Joshua, you got all kinds of really awesome heroes. But in those stories of the heroes, and we spend a lot of time as Christian churches, we spend a lot of time talking about the heroes, but there's something in each story of all those heroes, all the famous heroes, all the really good stories. They've got a good villain. They've got a good villain. And when I say good, I mean interesting. I mean not good as in morally, but they've got there's a villain who's really good at being a villain in those stories. Last week we talked about Goliath, probably the most famous villain in all of Scripture outside the devil himself. David and Goliath, what a story of the hero and the villain. And now today, where I want to go, the villainous story that I want to take you to, buckle up, is actually the first villain that we encounter in Scripture. Now, we're not counting the devil. We're not counting the devil as a villain, although obviously he is. But we want to talk about the people villains. And this one is the very first villain in Scriptures, and it's found in the story of Cain and Abel. Now, Cain and Abel is quite often, it's a known story, and one of the things that I want to bring out about it is that for a lot of the villains that we're gonna speak on, the villain acts themselves might not be super relatable for all of us. For Goliath, the villainous act that he did was he was a giant in an army who defied the armies of Israel. For most of us, that's not who we are. We haven't been in that place. We've never gone to battle with spears and swords and fought one-on-one duels with opposing enemies. We probably haven't done that. But most of us have siblings. And that automatically makes Cain and Abel just a little bit more relatable. But we're going to get into it. It's in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 to 16, and I'm going to read that to you now. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 begins like this. Now Adam had sexual relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant. When she gave birth to Cain, she said, "With the Lord's help, I have produced a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best of the firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift. And this made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. "Why are you so angry?" the Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. But you must subdue it and be its master." One day, Cain suggested to his brother, "Let's go out into the fields." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Afterward, the Lord asked Cain, "Where is your brother? Where is Abel?" "I don't know," Cain responded. "Am I my brother's guardian?" But the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which has swallowed your brother's blood. No longer will the ground yield good crops for you, no matter how hard you work. From now on, you will be a homeless wanderer on the earth." Cain replied to the Lord, "My punishment is too great for me to bear. You have banished me from the land and from your presence. You have made me a homeless wanderer. Anyone who finds me will kill me." The Lord replied, "No, for I will give a sevenfold punishment to anyone who kills you." And then the Lord put a mark on Cain to warn anyone who might try to kill him. So Cain left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Right away, we're 4 chapters into creation, and man has murdered already. When I think about the villain of Cain, when I think about what it is that's going on in his heart, there's a few things that pop off the page right away. The first one is that it seems as though, if Goliath was a villain of pride, then Cain could be considered as a villain of anger. is that he gets angry, and we see that twice. It says that he gets angry and dejected, and he gets angry and dejected. And one of the things that's difficult for me on the subject of anger is that I do not have a lot of experience with anger. Growing up in my home, my father, and my mother, I don't know if I've ever heard my father raise his voice. Like genuinely, I don't know, my sister's here, pretty close, hey? Like I don't know if I've ever heard him yell beyond ready or not, here I come. I don't know if I've ever heard him yell. And my wife as well, my wife is extremely, even-tempered, she doesn't have an angry bone in her body. And so for me, the subject of anger isn't something that I'm very accustomed to or even familiar with, but I know that for many people, it is a difficult, constant thing. But I think there's something more. I think that if we read into the story of Cain and we just see it as the villainousness of anger, I think we'd be missing something incredible. Now, there's some fascinating things in there. Cain acts out in anger, and then it says that he's going to be lonely, right? That's one of the punishments that God gives, that you are going to be a lonely wanderer in the world. And for people that deal with anger often, you'll know about the loneliness that comes from anger and the isolation and the social separation that happens to angry people and that angry people cause. But I think there's so much more going on in this story than just how not to be angry. You see, I think there's some fascinating little lessons that we can learn in this story. The first thing that I want to highlight to you is that it seems that this story brings to the forefront this idea that there is a right way to relate to God. Because right at the top, it says, when Cain and Abel grew up, Abel became a shepherd while Cain cultivated the ground. And when it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best of the firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift. It's easy to focus on Cain and how the Lord rejects Cain's gift, but it's also important to remember that there is a right way to experience God. There is a right way to relate to Him, and it's not just whatever we want. It's not just however we choose to approach God, is that it seems as though God has a set way that we are supposed to approach Him. And Abel, it shows, does the right thing, and Cain does the wrong thing. When we get to God, there is a way that you can do it right, and there is a way that we can relate to God that is wrong. Now, I can tell you that as someone who's read this story multiple times, many of the times that I've read it, doesn't it kind of seem like God's fault? Just a little bit? Man, there's a way that you can read this when it says, Abel also brought the gift, the best of his firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but He did not accept Cain and his gift. And it's like, is this God just being choosy? Is this God is this God trying to tell us that He's not a vegetarian? Because, Abel brings, some lambs, the firstborn of his flock. Cain brings some crops. Is this God saying that He doesn't like farmers? He prefers ranchers. Is that what's happening? Is this God just being choosy? Now, I just want to highlight this. I want to make this little point to you. If you read this and you go, God, it's God's fault for making Cain angry. And because Cain was angry, he killed Abel. If God was just nicer to Cain, then Abel wouldn't have died. I just want you to know, if you read that into this story, that is classic blame-shifting abuser language. Because my boss got me so angry, I kicked the dog. It's my boss's fault I kicked the dog. It's like, no. No. That's a big red flag. It's a big red flag. What that's doing is it's called shifting the external. It's creating an external locus of control and saying that you're actually not in control of your own actions. Other people are in control of your actions, which is a very dangerous thing to think. But this isn't God being choosy. And then also, when we read this story, one of the things that we can do is we say both are giving offerings to God. Shouldn't that be enough? So both are giving offerings. And then we can read this, and actually we don't necessarily read this, but we certainly live this sometimes. We say things like, shouldn't God be grateful that Cain was willing to give him anything at all? Here's Cain, and he's just doing his best. He's a farmer, and so he's got crops, and he's giving God what he has. Isn't that good enough? Shouldn't that be good enough? Shouldn't it be enough that Cain was willing to give him anything at all? Church, we do this with God. We do this with God even now, where we'll say things like, yeah, God, I give you 1 hour a week, to go to church. Isn't that enough? What do you mean you want my Saturday too? Or Monday, you want my whole life? Isn't just this part of it enough? Is God's standard too high? Wasn't Cain just trying his best? That's the way that we can read into this. We can read as Cain is a victim of a arbitrary, choosy, needy God. But I want you to see that there's a fascinating statement that God makes to him, that God makes to Cain. When God corrects Cain, he comes to him and he says this in verse 6. He says, "Why are you so angry?" Which is interesting. God says, "I reject your offering." Cain is angry and sad. And then God, there's no break in that statement. So God says, "Why are you angry?" God is right there saying, "Why are you angry?" The Lord asked Cain, "Why do you look so sad? Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out." Other translations say, "You know what to do to be right." You see, Cain, in his offering to God, isn't actually doing what he knows is right. Cain is actually violating himself. That's what God's saying to him. Cain isn't Cain isn't going, "This is the best that I can do." Cain knows that what he's doing, how he's presenting to God, is wrong. Cain is doing things that he knows he shouldn't do. That's what God's telling him. You know what to do to be right. That's why he's saying, "Why are you angry? Why are you sad?" You know what to do. You know what to do, but you're not doing it. You know what to do. You know the right thing to do, but you're not doing it. In Romans chapter 7, verse 18 to 19 might be the most relatable verse in all of Scripture. Romans 7, verse 18 to 19 says this. This is Paul speaking, and he says, "I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway." Here's Cain, the perfect example of this, where God right away, Genesis chapter 4, he highlights to Cain, you know what to do. You know the right way to relate. You know the right way to live. You know how you're supposed to be interacting. You know how you're supposed to be giving. You know how you're supposed to be sacrificing, but you're not doing it. And see, for us, for Christians, this is such a problem, is that we know what to do, especially for me. Man, I grew up in the church. I got saved at 3 years old. Every sin I've ever committed, I committed as a Christian. I never committed anything in ignorance. I knew, I imagine that even for most of you, even you could remember in the days when you weren't a Christian, you knew that the wrong things you were doing, you still knew they were wrong. You didn't need anyone to tell you that you shouldn't be angry, that you shouldn't lie, that you shouldn't be cheating on your spouse. You don't need anyone to reinforce that to you. You already knew. And that's what God speaks to Cain. He says, you know what to do. Why are you so mad? Why are you so sad? You will be accepted if you do what is right. The problem is that it's so hard, isn't it? That Paul writes that. He says, I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. Let me just, just to bring this in a little bit more. How many fathers in this room, how many this isn't a hands thing, but how many of you fathers in this room know how to be a better dad? I think most of us. We know that if we spent more time, if we were more active, if we were more engaged, if we made the little sacrifices to give ourselves a little bit more energy, to pour into in a positive way with our kids, I don't think that we have a knowledge problem. I think we know. How many husbands, I'm only going to pick on the husbands because I am one. And for how many of you husbands, how many of you know how to be a better husband? I think, like, just speaking for me, I think we know. I think we know the little things that we could do. I think we know just those little actions, those little conversations, those little moments in our day that we could make more effective in our husbandry, in our husbanding. We know. The problem isn't a lack of knowledge. And that's what God says to Cain. God says, you know what to do to be right. And that's what Paul says. We know what to do. The problem isn't a lack of information. It's a lack of application. Already in Genesis 4, we see one of the problems, not just a problem, anger is a problem. We see what might just be the problem. That from Genesis till now, we struggle with, don't we? Is that we know the right thing to do, but we don't do it. In this passage, we see some interesting things. We see there is a right way and a wrong way to relate to God. It seems as though God has a system, God has a standard, God has a way in which we're supposed to relate to him. And it's not just any old way, and it's not just any old how. And then also, we can do it wrong. And we know we do it wrong. We know when we're out of line. We know that there's more good. We know that there's better that we could do. There's a way that we can relate to God. But then there's this really interesting little moment. I want to spend the rest of our time just on this little thought that God throws out there. When God is describing, and we got to remember, this is actually one of the very first times that God mentions that the word sin ever shows up, just so you know, is in this story. And it's interesting that it comes from God speaking to Cain, and God describes the nature of sin to Cain. This is sin's introduction to humanity, essentially, from the mouth of God anyway. And it goes like this. This is what God says about sin and what it's like to Cain. He says, "Why are you so angry?" The Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right, but if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin," again, this is like one of the first times that it shows up in all of Scripture. "Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. You must subdue it and be its master." Sin is at the door. Now, I want to just let you think about this for a moment here. If sin is at the door, then is sin in Cain? Where is sin in relation to Cain, according to God in this passage? Sin is outside of Cain. Cain's got a house, according to the way that God's describing it. Cain's got a house, Cain is in the house, and sin is at the door, waiting to come in. Now, you might read into that and you go, oh, sin is at the door. Actually, okay, so sin isn't actually in me. Sin isn't actually part of who I am. Sin is this outside thing, that's influencing me. And actually, without that sin, I'm actually really good. But don't you see, that makes it actually worse. If sin was already in the house, if sin was built in, if sin was actually who you are, then you are just the constant victim of it. But in this description of God with sin, he says that sin is at the door, which means that every time we sin, that means every time that we act on sin, we are opening the door to sin. That we are the ones inviting it in, that we're the ones who are actively participating, choosing it, bringing it inside. The higher you think of yourself, the worse our sin becomes. If you think, man, if you have the mindset and you say, like, people are good, like we're innocent and pure, and it's only, it's sin is entirely exterior, and really fundamentally deep down, all of us, we're just these good, golden, perfect things who do wrong things. Don't you realize that the better you make yourself, then the worse your sin becomes? That the more often, that the higher you esteem yourself and your nature and your choices and who you are, then every time you open the door to sin, it's more and more egregious. Oh, when I sin, that's not really me. That's not who I really am. Don't you see? That makes it so much worse. It's a further and further step away. Every time we sin, every time, like Cain, we act in what we know is wrong. We are opening the door. We are letting sin in. We are failing to subdue it and to master it. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, God makes it plain. He says, "Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessing and cursing. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice that you make. Oh, that you would choose life." Is that God saying there is sin at the door? Don't open the door to the sin. Don't act on that. You know what to do to be right. You know what to do. Cain, of course, doesn't do it. Cain, of course, after hearing the voice of God, when God speaks to him and says, "You know what to do to be right." Isn't it interesting that Cain doesn't fix his sacrifice? God tells Cain, "Your sacrifice is wrong," and you know the right thing to do. Cain doesn't fix his sacrifice. Cain never agrees with God. Cain never changes his actions. He never fixes his sacrifice. As a matter of fact, he would rather kill the one who did it right than do it right himself. He'd rather kill Abel, who did the right thing, than do the right thing himself. Cain never agrees with God. He never changes his action, and he never fixes his sacrifice. Just so you know, like the whole rest of the Old Testament from Genesis to Malachi is wrestling with men who don't, or is men wrestling with God. They don't agree, they don't change, and they don't fix it. All the stories, all the histories from the time of Adam till now is just a churning and frothing of these problems, of the problem in the heart of all humanity, is that we know what to do. We know the way to be right, and we just don't do it. If Goliath was a villain, and he was, Cain is us. Cain is who we are. And again, just looking back at that Romans verse where it says, "I know nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. And I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway." It actually concludes Paul saying, "Oh, what a wretched man that I am." But I want you to know something, church, is that in this story of Cain and Abel, it'd be a mistake to think that there's only Cain and Abel. Is that there's Cain, Abel, and God. And one of the beautiful parts of this story, one of the most incredible parts of this story, honestly, is that God is with Cain. It says, God says to Cain that sin is knocking on the door. But sin, my brothers and sisters, sin isn't the only thing that's knocking on the door of our hearts. In the book of Revelations, chapter 3, verse 19 to 20, it says this. It says, this is Jesus speaking, he says, "I correct and discipline everyone I love. So be diligent and turn from your indifference. Look, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and we will share a meal together as friends." Verse 21 says, "Those who are victorious will sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat with my Father on his throne." Do you see, my brothers and sisters, sin will knock on the door of your heart, and it will knock from now until the day that we meet God in heaven. But he is not the only one knocking on the door. Is that Jesus knocks on the door as well. The great tragedy of Cain is that he knew what to do to be right, and God was there, but he never brings God into his story. He never brings God into his heart, into his situation. And for us, we know what to do to be right, and God is knocking on the door of our hearts, and we want to be set free. We want to be forgiven. We want to move beyond just the sin that holds us and binds us and haunts us. We want to move into what we're called to do. We don't want to just be these people that just constantly fail and disappoint ourselves with our sin. Then how do we overcome it? Then what do? We do what Cain never did. You see, Cain opened his door again to sin, again and again and again. But Jesus is knocking on the door of our hearts. And when we invite him in, he changes us. He sets us free. You know, in that Romans passage, Paul concludes it. He says, "Oh, what a miserable man that I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death?" Thank God, the answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the hero. He's the hero that Cain never found but was there. God was with Cain. God was speaking to Cain. God was in the presence of Cain, but Cain opened his door to sin again and again. And God is knocking on our door. He is knocking on the door of our hearts to set us free. You know, Romans 6, verse 12 to 14 says this: "Do not let sin control the way that you live. Do not give in to sinful desires. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourself completely to God. For you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. Sin is no longer your master, for you no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you live under the freedom of God's grace." You see, my brothers and sisters, there is a way to be made right with God. The way to be made right with God is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. That is the way. There is a way to live free from the dominion and control and mastery of sin. That way is Jesus Christ. It's not any old way, any old how, you know. Shouldn't God be happy with just a little bit? Isn't God just too choosy? Isn't he just too picky? There is a way. Jesus is the way. You see, sin is knocking on the door of your hearts. You know it, I know it. You know when, you know how, you know exactly what it sounds like, you know exactly what it'll do to you, and you know exactly how far it'll take you. Jesus is knocking too. See, in the story of Cain and Abel, you know, when Goliath loses, Cain wins. And for us, we need to do what Cain didn't. We need to open our hearts to Jesus. We need to allow him in. And when we invite him in, the same way that we bring sin into our life, when we bring Jesus into our life, he changes us. He sets us free. He redeems us. He makes us new. He did it for me. He can do it for you.